Hello, my name is Corey Ransom. I'm a weed scientist and the extension weed specialist at Utah State University in Logan, Utah. I've been invited to be part of the panel today not because I've done extensive modeling, but because I've tried to utilize modeling in helping inform land managers in making good land management decisions. I think we would all agree that weed inventories provide information that is vital in developing an effective weed management strategy. But in addition to this, it can also help us understand things about weed biology by knowing where weeds are commonly found. It can also be used for documenting management success through monitoring. It can be used for modeling, which we'll talk about on the panel, but the data is only as useful as it is accurate. By utilizing the same methodologies between inventories, we were able to document changes in Russian knapweed infestations in response to 8 years of management at Dinosaur National Monument. However, when we analyzed data from repeated inventories conducted on the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, we found that some of the large changes in total infested acres between the two surveys most likely had more to do with the size of polygons used to illustrate those infestations than it did with actual changes in weed populations on the ground. We became interested in modeling because of its ability to answer additional questions, such as why are the weeds growing where they are? Where would I look for additional infestations of a particular species? And if I don't manage a particular species, where would I expect it to spread to? And finally, where are management efforts best employed to be the most effective? In one modeling project, we worked with Tim Prather from the University of Idaho to determine if we could adapt a model that he developed to predict rust skeleton weed habitat suitability in northern Idaho and apply it to the area around the Great Salt Lake. While the model worked very well in the canyonlands of northern Idaho, it didn't work quite as well for predicting rust skeleton weed distributions in the Salt Lake area, probably due to much more variable and less predictable wind speeds and directions. Accurate weed distribution data can not only help with management efforts by identifying where weeds are currently, but also by predicting where you might expect them to be now and in the future.
Good afternoon. I'm Doug Johnson with the California Invasive Plant Council. I want to briefly describe why land managers need modeling. The answer is that modeling can help land managers be strategic at the landscape scale. I'll show you what I mean by looking at several online tools that help translate modeling data into something that land managers can use. We can all agree that mapping is essential in helping decide what weeds to work on where. We can't control all the weeds everywhere. We need to prioritize. Modeling is simply an extension of mapping. It takes the mapping information we have and extrapolates from it to tell us where the conditions are right for that plant to grow. Not only that, but it can also take into account how conditions may shift due to climate change, so we can see where conditions will be right for that plant in the future. In the Cal Weed Mapper tool, we have data showing where different weeds are found. Here we're looking at a map for barb goatgrass. It's found in the grid cells shown in tan, and then based on where the plant currently grows, the tool extrapolates where else the conditions are suitable for it to grow. That's shown in green. We can see that there's lots of territory for this weed to spread into, and that there are some isolated pioneer populations and potentially some leading edges where control is important for addressing spread at the landscape scale. You can find similar functionality in EdMaps. It's found under the counties selection when you're looking at the distribution map for a particular plant. Here we're looking at a map of giant reed, Arundo donax. The purple shaded counties are ones where the plant currently grows, and the orange shaded counties are ones where conditions are, or will be by mid-century, suitable for the plant to grow. Maps like these help us to anticipate where each weed might spread, and that's important information to have when deciding where to focus resources at the landscape level. Last, the pre-climate matching tool is set up for a user to select one or more states or ecoregions and then be able to see where else in the world has similar climatic conditions. Here I selected 3 ecoregions in Southern California where a new weed, desert knapweed, is found, and based on that, the tool generates the green shaded areas. That gives us an idea of where this new weed could spread if we aren't successful in containing it. Pretty scary, especially given that this is only based on the few places where the plant currently occurs. Its potential suitable range could be much larger. So based on the rapid spread of that plant and its suspected range, we're making it a high priority and trying to get mobilized to get after it. That's a quick overview of some of the ways land managers can benefit from the results of modeling. And I want to leave you with a reminder that modeling relies on mapping data. So it's important that land managers contribute mapping data to a platform like EdMaps where modelers can access it and build on it. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Mark Renz, and I'm here today to talk to you about some of our efforts using models to improve monitoring and management of invasive plants in Wisconsin. Well, many of you know invasive species are spreading nationally. The same is the case in Wisconsin, as can be seen by this graph. Over the last 20 years, we've seen dramatic increases in occurrences of many of our terrestrial invasive plants. But unfortunately, resources are limited, and those resources continue to shrink over time at various scales. And so we're really looking at using these models to help be more efficient, and how can we integrate them into some of our decision-making processes. And I think this example with Japanese barberry, which is an EDRR species, is really a good way to look at this. In 2005, we only had about 50 to 60 known populations of Japanese barberry in the state. Fast forward 15 years to 2020, and we have approximately tenfold the number of known occurrences widely distributed across the entire state. And really understanding what are the factors that leads to suitable habitat would be really important, would have been important in this situation, and even moving forward will continue to be important. If we have these suitability models that predict where those suitable habitats are, we can be much more efficient in how we use our resources and protect these lands, and in the case of Japanese barberry, human health. And so that's what we've done, is we've created these habitat suitability models for 21 invasive terrestrial plants in Wisconsin, as can be seen here in these pictures. And really our goal with these, besides just relaying this information to our stakeholders, we wanted to really evaluate what's driving suitable habitat so we can better understand our enemy here. We wanted to also test how well these models perform, because believe it or not, rarely are models validated with separate amounts of data. And so we wanted to understand, are these models really working well, and how well should we rely on them? And then all this information we want to incorporate and extend out to our clientele so that they can improve their management plans on the ground level. And EdMaps was a critical tool that we utilized for this. We work closely with the First Detectors Network, which is a community science network, but we also worked with other stakeholders that really found EdMaps as a critical tool. As you can see here, because of these efforts, we used over 20,000 reports from EdMaps to either create these models or validate these models. So if you were someone who were in Wisconsin reporting through EdMaps, I'd like to personally thank you for those efforts. We couldn't have done this project without your support. So right now we're in the phase of extending this information out to others. If interested in getting some of these hot off the press fact sheets that summarize our results, visit our website, as you can see here, or send me an email, and we can get that information to you and help you understand what our results are and how you can use these to improve things at your level or wherever you are. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm Catherine Jarnevich with the USGS in Fort Collins, Colorado. Most of my research relates to predicting the potential distributions of invasive plant species, often at the national level. I want to start by recognizing how far we've come with invasive species data. For my graduate student work 2 decades ago, I gathered as many invasive plant data sets as I could for the state of Colorado and merged them to look at patterns of weed distributions in the state and develop a habitat suitability model. Gathering data sets from different entities in the state and merging them took a couple years. Thanks to everyone contributing data to EDD Maps and other aggregators, it's now a quick process to obtain multiple occurrence data sets, such as these locations for over 100 species obtained overnight. These occurrences can be matched with environmental information to create habitat suitability models. For example, we've developed distribution models for over 140 priority invasive plant species in the U.S. in partnership with Department of Interior agencies. The National Park Service invasive plant management teams are now using these national extent models as part of their planning activities, and they highlight the tool for individual park managers planning prevention, early detection and rapid response, and control efforts. Looking broadly, these models can help develop watch lists, while locally, they can point to unknown infestations, such as the spouting grass one in Joshua Tree National Park, where models predicted high habitat suitability in previous unsampled locations, as shown here. We can make these models even better with more information on where people are searching for plants. We're good at capturing where we find species, but not as good at recording where we don't find them. When you look at maps of data you have collected, does it seem to reflect what you know about the species, where a species is already present or abundant, or does it reflect the satellite populations that we may be more likely to record? For example, this map showing location data in Saguaro National Park doesn't have data at higher elevations for bufflegrass. And just looking at this map, you wouldn't know if this area is unsurveyed or if the species is absent from there. Models will always do better with information from the core of an invasion and with absence information, and better models in turn will be able to better inform management decisions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Bethany Bradley and I wanted to talk to you about incorporating abundance into invasive plant risk assessment. So Catherine just talked about all of the awesome work that she and her team have been doing on understanding invasive species potential ranges or the distribution of where species could occur. But the geography of invasive plant abundance, so that is the areas where they're spreading and where they're likely to become, what we would think of as invasive, that's a subset of that total potential range. So an important next step is to use data from EDMAPs and from other sources to assess the potential for invasive species to become abundant. So in other words, our next step is moving from predicting presence from where, small populations or single, plants could occur to predicting where they could really have these large scale ecological consequences. And we've done some preliminary work, and this is work based on EDMAP's data from a few years ago. And what we've seen is that the areas where lots of different invasive plants could establish, so basically where the ranges of lots of invasive plants overlap, are not the same as where the ranges of lots of plants can become, where they would become abundant overlap. So in other words, the hot spots that we identify where lots of plants can establish in blue here are different from the hot spots where lots of invasive plants could become abundant, which are in red. And the overlap between those two is in purple, which means that we can't use range alone to predict abundance. So abundance is not kind of a consistent subset of where species can establish. So this was a preliminary assessment using EDMAP's data from about 5 years ago. We've got a lot better data today, and we're definitely headed in the right direction. And so what kinds of data do we need? So first of all, there's this fantastic amount of abundance data already in the EDMAP's data set. We have about 500,000 data points as of a few months ago. Percent cover is the most commonly reported metric of abundance in the EDMAP's data set. So if you are collecting abundance information and you want to be consistent with what a lot of other people are doing, percent cover is the way to go. Continuous cover is great. Cover classes are also absolutely workable in modeling frameworks, and common cover classes are at the bottom. And then another point to raise, which is important both for modeling ranges, so potential distributions, as well as modeling potential abundance, is that we continue to lack information about absence, which becomes really critical if you're trying to model where species could exist and where they could become abundant and invasive. So keep collecting those awesome data. We are super happy to be using them from the modeling perspective. They make a huge difference in terms of the types of models and analyses that we can create. Thanks so much.
Wow, that was really fantastic. Thank you all so very much. Learning a lot today. Okay, so let's see. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So, okay, first question, and whomever wants to tackle this first, jump right in. Do you believe that models are becoming more accurate over time? If so, why? What sorts of factors influence the accuracy of your model results?
Well, I'll unmute fastest of the group. I think that, so this is my personal opinion. So models have been coming a long way in terms of the different model frameworks that exist. There's not necessarily one sort of superior one. A lot of times what we do is we use a lot of different model frameworks together to try to see what the consensus looks like. But my perspective on this is that it's actually the data underlying the models that are most important. And that's where EDMAP's data become really critical. If we're missing, like in Catherine's presentation for the buffalo grass distributions, if you're missing a whole set of area that hasn't been sampled, then your models are going to reflect that. So there's nothing that a model can do to make up for a lack of, sort of a wholesale lack of undersampling.
I might just jump in on the data collection, that if your points are very precise, then that is going to increase the effectiveness of a particular model. But if you have a few scattered plants and you map those as a 1 acre polygon, that accounts for a lot of the variation that the model's trying to account for. And so again, if you can kind of set the type of resolution at which you collect your data, that is going to help models be much more effective in the future.
I'd jump in and also say that in addition to the location data, like what we're getting from EDD maps becoming more available and better, also the data that we have to characterize the environment to create these models is also becoming better, and that can also lead to improvements in the models. So there's better representation of soils over space, and with remote sensing we can capture a lot of other things that we weren't able to even a decade ago.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and summarize and say, yes, it is getting better. It is because of the data we're collecting. And Catherine said, one of the things that we do a lot, and I know Catherine and I'm sure Bethany does, is we do an iterative approach. So we do an initial model, we get those results out there. People on the landscape tell us where it's wrong, and they give us more data that allows us to improve it. And I think that's really the biggest benefit in how we improve these as time moves forward.
From the modelers here, I'm curious to know how you would answer this question in terms of projections for future conditions. So many folks have done projections for mid-century based on how many of the multiple models out there for climate projections match. And I'm wondering if those models are getting better. It certainly makes a big difference whether you say all 15 models need to match or only 5 need to match in some of the tools that you've developed. How do you see that trajectory?
So I've done some of that. I think that one of the big improvements that I've seen over the last few years with the climate projections, so the climate change forecasting, is that there are ones that work better for some regions and work less well for other regions. And that's true within the US. So the models that work really well in the Western US aren't necessarily the exact same ones that seem to, and we don't know what the future of course brings. So this is more hindcasting. It's sort of looking at how well they predict the last 100 years of climate in those regions. And the climate modeling community has come a long way in the last few years of characterizing, okay, these are the models that do a really good job of modeling precipitation in the Western US. And so what we do oftentimes is we put all of those different things together. But if if we know that, species that we're interested in is really responding to precipitation, and that's an important variable, then we can do that sort of next level now of saying, okay, we're going to pick this subset that we know models this particular predictor very well in this particular region.
Yeah, and I think another challenge with the looking at climate change and how it impacts it is all these models assume everything else is the same and only climate changes. And a great example is we're doing work on future spread of Phragmites in Wisconsin, and it's showing it spreading into our forests. Well, we know Phragmites doesn't do well in forests, but we don't know, are there going to be forests in the future in those areas too? So there's limitations that unless you're integrating models with other models that make it really tough. But I think they're a good place to start and start with the prioritization and making some decisions because things are going to change. And so that's a start, but we have a long way to go, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to just ask kind of a follow-up question to that. Are there examples or are there opportunities where the climate models and the invasive species models, as you just gave an example, Phragmites, are being intersected to inform advocacy or to inform, decision-making, given that climate change is a top priority of the current administration? And just thinking about our previous session on using data to inform, regulatory and legislative and funding decisions. Is there data currently being used to model this connection between climate change and invasive species that can be used for advocacy? Or what are your opinions or thoughts on doing that?
So we have one tool that's on the EDMAP's website, which is the range shift listing tool, which is based on models for about 900 plants under future climate. And Doug showed a picture from one of those models in his presentation. In the Northeast, so I'm from Massachusetts, so in the Northeast, we have been using those lists basically, so state level lists of which species come out as potentially invasive in the future. And we've been building, Invasive Plant Council network in the Northeast to try to get that information into the state regulatory processes. And I feel like we have a good list, starting point for lists. So that's definitely a potential thing that more state regulatory boards or invasive plant groups could definitely get into in the future.
Yeah, and I think maps are always great communication tools. We're all very aware of the nuances of the models and that, they aren't truth, but I think it can be very useful to be able to show a map like the ones that Bethany was just describing, where you can see that, well, this species is here now, and it could be much more widespread as a message of we need to act, or this is going to be a lot worse. So whether it's just spread based on suitable habitat because the thing hasn't done spreading yet, and or spread because of future climatic conditions, I think this can be very powerful in conveying that message to decision makers.
We found that even some of the outputs that come from modeling, like correlations between roads or rivers or other things that are considered in the model, can also be really interesting in that with the data where we mapped on roads and trails, it was interesting that some of the species modeled didn't correlate well with roads and trails, which is where the mapping was conducted. And so in that case, that those species are adapted to spread out into undisturbed environments, whereas the ones that were highly correlated with roads and trails would suggest that you ought to keep treating weeds on those disturbed sites on those roads and trails. And so again, I think even parts of the data that comes from mapping or modeling can be used to help inform management as well.
Yeah, absolutely. To better direct our citizen scientists and our early detectors out there to fill in those holes. We did have a question about how do you address greater reporting in high use areas and along roads and trails in these models. So thank you, Corey. Any other thoughts on that as well from anybody else?
We take into account that, how people tend to collect data in easier to access locations in the modeling by the way we create these models is comparing where we find a species to the available environment to a species. And so we can limit what environment we say is available to them based on what we know of where people have sampled. And so that is something that is considered in the development. But that's where absence data can be useful as well, because if you're collecting absence data, then we know where you went and looked, and that you only looked next to roads and trails and not farther away.
I did notice the question about absence data in the Q&A, and I think that's a really important thing for tools like EdMaps to consider, and it seems like they are, on how to make it easy to enter absence data for an area you've surveyed. One thing that we found effective in California was conducting a survey. We had the opportunity to do it for the whole state because we had a significant grant to fund that, but basically to survey land managers on a grid to say where is and is, where do you know that a plant is and know that it is not, or suspect that it is not. And that gave us a course level presence absence grid across the whole landscape, as opposed to just looking at where are there points that people have put in. And so I think that can be very useful.
We always, for some of the contract mapping we did, we always, of course, collected a track log of where we had been. And then based on the detection swath width or how far the mappers could see from side to side, then we would create a buffered polygon based on the track log. And so if you're doing more intense mapping, those track logs can be really helpful in creating an actual search area in which your points then would be collected.
Are there plans that you're aware of to rerun existing invasive species spread models, such as the range shifting listing model that you discussed and the habitat suitability models, as new information arrives? And how frequently do those sorts of updates need to happen?
That's a really good question. The range shift listing tool was from funding that we don't have anymore. So we don't have any immediate plans to do those, but I can turn it over to Catherine because I know that her group is working a lot on constant updates to the Inhabit tool, which I think is, another really awesome parallel tool that everybody can be looking at for some of the most problematic invasive species out there.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. So the Inhabit tool that I showed an image of in my talk has over 140 species that we've modeled in it. And currently we're running a second iteration for all those models based on new location data that's been collected since these were originally run, feedback from on the ground people that have provided information on how they think those models are good or not as good, and then also updating the predictors in those. And so we do have plans to continue to update these over time as more information becomes available.
Yeah, and I would just chime in and say that I'd really recommend trying to do some separate validations of some of these models and use that to inform the level of updates. Some of these models work really well, and I know Catherine and Bethany have made some of these models probably don't need to be updated that frequently, while others are probably performing pretty poorly and will need some more updating. So it's just a time and resource availability. And this is why I love hanging out with Bethany and Catherine. They've got much better resources than I do to do these updates and keep more up to speed than we're able to do. And so they're just been a tremendous platform to move things forward. So I want to personally thank them for all they've done.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Okay, we have a few more questions popping in. You should have seen the poll results pop up. And so about a third of folks have used model results to inform management, and almost everybody definitely sees the potential benefits of models. And so thank you for illuminating the many ways that these models can be helpful and useful for management and decision making. And then you can see kind of the places that folks are collecting data. And so thank you to those of you participating that took the poll. Appreciate that. Question: are there links on how invasive plants affect local wildlife? Have we connected the dots between, and I see head shaking, yes, between species of concern, native wildlife, and even threatened and endangered species? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I'd say that we are starting to look at the intersections between spatial distribution of invasive plants and locations of listed threatened and endangered plant species, and trying to figure out how to integrate some of that information into the management plans for local land managers so that they may not be managing the property where the endangered species is, But if they're in the area and there are particular weed species that are a threat to that endangered species, trying to make sure that at least in that asset protection zone, that they're aware of working on that, even if the weed's widespread elsewhere.